Sophie Thompson had always been a woman of resilience. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, she learned early on that life was not always fair, but it was always worth fighting for. She put herself through college, earning a degree in business administration, and met Mark during her sophomore year. He was charming, with an easy smile and an infectious laugh, and he pursued her relentlessly. Sophie, drawn to his carefree nature, fell deeply in love. Their relationship, at first, seemed like a fairy tale. Mark Daniels came from a well-off family, and while his parents were polite to Sophie, she could sense they weren't thrilled about him dating a black woman. But Mark didn't care, or at least that's what he said. He was always quick to brush off any awkwardness or comments, assuring Sophie that love was all that mattered. Sophie believed him, and in their love, she found a sense of belonging. After graduating, Sophie and Mark got married in a small ceremony. Life seemed perfect. They bought a cozy house in the suburbs, and Sophie quickly advanced in her career. The only thing missing was a child. After a year of trying, they were overjoyed when Sophie finally became pregnant. They spent months preparing for the arrival of their baby, decorating the nursery, attending parenting classes, and imagining what their future would look like as a family of 3. But when Sophie went into labor, the dream of a perfect family began to crack. The birth was more complicated than expected, and Sophie was exhausted by the time William was delivered. When the doctor handed her the baby, she was too tired to notice anything out of the ordinary at first. It wasn't until Mark's voice cut through the haze that she realized something was wrong. "Why is he so pale?" Mark's voice was filled with disbelief. Sophie blinked and looked down at William. Her heart swelled with love as she cradled the tiny life in her arms, but it didn't take long to see what Mark was talking about. William's skin was fair, paler than either of theirs, with light blue eyes and a dusting of blonde hair. Sophie's stomach twisted in confusion. How could their child look like this? The nurses quickly assured them that it was entirely possible for 2 people of color to have a child with lighter skin due to distant ancestry. Genetic variation was complex, they explained, and William's appearance wasn't unheard of. Still, Mark remained distant, his face unreadable. Sophie was too tired to argue or process it all. She spent the night in the hospital holding William, marveling at his tiny features, determined to ignore Mark's coldness. She thought he would come around once they were home and settled, that he just needed time to adjust. But as days turned into weeks, it became clear that Mark was struggling more than she could have imagined. Back at home, Sophie tried her best to create a sense of normalcy. She spent hours bonding with William, loving him more deeply every day. But Mark's attitude grew increasingly strained. He would stare at William for long moments, then turn away, refusing to hold him. When Sophie brought it up, Mark would brush her off, claiming he was just tired from work. But Sophie knew better. His detachment wasn't just exhaustion. It was something deeper. One night, Sophie confronted him. "What's wrong, Mark?" she asked, her voice steady but full of concern. "You've been distant since the day William was born. He's your son, our son. Why can't you see that?" Mark hesitated, his jaw clenched, before finally blurting out, "I don't know, Sophie. I don't know how to feel. Every time I look at him, he doesn't look like me. Or you. He doesn't even feel like he's mine." The words cut through Sophie like a knife. She had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made the wound that much deeper. "How can you say that? He's our child, Mark. Blood doesn't lie." "I'm not saying he's not ours," Mark snapped, running his hands through his hair. "But do you know how it feels when people ask questions? When they look at him and then look at me like they're trying to figure out what happened? It's like a constant reminder that something's off." Sophie's heart sank. She knew people whispered, knew they asked insensitive questions, but she hadn't realized how much it had been affecting Mark. "I don't care what people think. All that matters is that William is healthy and loved, and if you can't accept him as he is, then maybe you need to take a hard look at yourself." Mark fell silent, staring at the floor. Sophie felt a tear slide down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. She couldn't afford to be weak. Not now. Not when William needed her to be strong. Days turned into months, and while Sophie tried her best to hold her little family together, Mark drifted further away. His excuses for staying late at work became more frequent, and when he was home, he was distant. His interactions with William strained and awkward. Sophie felt like she was losing him, but her primary focus remained on her son. Then, one cold winter afternoon, Sophie came home from a grocery run to find a note on the kitchen counter. "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry. Mark." Sophie stared at the note in disbelief, her hands trembling. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to cry. Not for Mark, not for the man who had abandoned them both. Sophie held William close that night, whispering promises of love and protection into his tiny ear. Mark might have walked away, but Sophie would never leave him. She vowed then and there to raise her son in a home full of love and acceptance, no matter what challenges lay ahead. And so, Sophie became both mother and father to William, pouring every ounce of her heart into raising him, determined to prove that love didn't depend on appearances or societal expectations. It was a difficult path, but one Sophie was more than ready to walk. Little did she know, though, that life had more in store for her than just surviving. There was still hope, love, and redemption waiting on the horizon, in the form of an unexpected man named Sam, who would soon change their lives forever. Raising William as a single mother was both the hardest and most rewarding journey Sophie had ever taken. Every day brought new challenges, but Sophie faced them head-on, determined to give William the life he deserved. As William grew, his bright, curious nature began to shine. He was quick to laugh, always asking questions about the world around him, and Sophie took immense pride in the boy he was becoming. But as William reached school age, the questions and stares from others became more frequent. "Is he adopted?" people would ask, their eyes flicking between William's pale complexion and Sophie's darker skin. Sophie would always answer with a smile, trying to keep her composure, but the constant questioning chipped away at her. Every time someone made an assumption about their family, it was a reminder of how society still struggled to accept differences. Sophie did her best to shelter William from the judgment, but she couldn't stop him from noticing. One afternoon, as they walked home from the park, William turned to her, his small hand holding hers tightly. "Mommy, why don't I look like you?" Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She had always known this day would come, but hearing the question from her 6-year-old son still made her chest tighten. She knelt down in front of him, looking into his innocent blue eyes. "William," she began gently, "you are perfect just the way you are. Families don't all look the same. You might have lighter skin than me, but that doesn't change anything about who we are. You're my son, and I love you more than anything." William nodded, processing her words. "But why do people ask all the time?" Sophie sighed softly, brushing a lock of his hair back. "Some people don't understand that families can look different, but that's okay. What matters is that we know we belong to each other, and no one else's opinion can change that." William smiled and hugged her tightly, and Sophie held him close, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders, but also the strength she found in her love for him. She promised herself that she would continue to teach William to be proud of who he was, no matter what others said. It was around this time that Sophie met Sam Carter. It had been years since she had thought about dating again. After Mark left, Sophie poured herself into being the best mother she could be, but as William grew more independent, Sophie found herself longing for companionship. She wanted someone to share her life with, someone who would love her and William unconditionally. Still, the idea of opening her heart again terrified her. What if it ended the same way? What if another man couldn't handle the complexities of their family? She met Sam at a community event held at the local recreation center. Sophie had volunteered to help run a bake sale to raise funds for a local youth sports league, and Sam was there coaching the kids in a basketball tournament. Sophie first noticed him from afar. He was tall, with a warm, easy smile, and his deep laugh carried across the court. But what struck her most was the way he interacted with the children. showing patience and kindness in a way that reminded her of the father figure she had always imagined for William. Later in the day, as Sophie was packing up her table, Sam walked over to introduce himself. "Hey, I'm Sam," he said with a grin. "I saw you running the bake sale earlier. Those cookies were a big hit with the kids." Sophie smiled, wiping her hands on a napkin. "Glad to hear it. I'm Sophie, by the way. I think the kids deserve most of the credit. They have a way of making everything more fun." Sam chuckled. "That's true. They certainly keep me on my toes. My nephew's on the team, so I help out when I can." From there, the conversation flowed easily. They talked about their work, their hobbies, and their shared passion for giving back to the community. Sophie found herself laughing more than she had in a long time, her nerves slowly easing as Sam's genuine nature put her at ease. As they chatted, William ran up, tugging on Sophie's sleeve. "Mommy, can we get ice cream on the way home?" Sophie smiled down at him. "Sure, sweetheart. Just give me a minute, okay?" Sam looked at William with a soft smile, crouching down to his level. "Hey there, buddy. What's your name?" William looked up at Sophie, seeking her approval, and she nodded. "I'm William." "Well, William, I think ice cream sounds like a great idea." "You've got good taste," Sam said with a wink, standing back up. William grinned, clearly charmed by Sam. "Thanks." After William ran off to play, Sam turned back to Sophie. "You've got a great kid. He seems really smart." Sophie's heart warmed at the compliment. "He is. He's my world." "I can tell," Sam said, his voice sincere. "You're doing an amazing job, Sophie." They exchanged numbers that day, agreeing to keep in touch, and over the next few weeks, Sam and Sophie began seeing more of each other. Their initial connection deepened as they spent more time together, and Sophie quickly realized how different Sam was from Mark. Where Mark had once shied, away from responsibility and the challenges of raising William, Sam leaned in with warmth and enthusiasm. The first time Sam came over for dinner, Sophie was nervous. She wasn't sure how William would react to having someone new in their home, but her worries quickly faded when she saw how effortlessly Sam and William got along. William, ever curious, peppered Sam with questions throughout the evening. "Do you play basketball all the time?" William asked, his eyes wide as he watched Sam tell stories about his coaching days. "Not all the time," Sam replied with a grin. "But whenever I can. Maybe I can teach you some tricks one day." William's face lit up with excitement. "Really? That would be awesome." Sophie watched them from the kitchen, her heart swelling with emotion. It wasn't just the way Sam interacted with William that touched her. It was the way he treated both of them. Sam wasn't just dating Sophie. He was embracing the family she had built with William. Every time he showed up, he brought warmth and laughter into their home, and Sophie found herself falling for him more and more with each passing day. As the weeks turned into months, Sophie and Sam grew closer. He became a steady presence in their lives, joining them for dinners, trips to the park, and even helping William with his school projects. For the first time since Mark's departure, Sophie felt like she had found someone she could truly rely on, someone who accepted her and William completely. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie after William had gone to bed, Sam turned to Sophie, a serious look in his eyes. "You know, Sophie," he began softly, "I care about you and William. A lot. I just want you to know that I'm here for both of you, no matter what." Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. She had been so afraid to let herself love again. But here was Sam, offering her the very thing she had been longing for: stability, love, and acceptance. "I care about you too, Sam," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been so scared to let someone in again, but you've shown me that I can trust you." Sam took her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "You can always trust me. I'm not going anywhere." That night, as Sophie lay in bed, her thoughts raced. Could she really have found someone who would stay? Someone who would stand by her and William through thick and thin? Her heart wanted to believe it, but her mind still whispered doubts. What if Sam, like Mark, eventually grew tired of the challenges that came with their unconventional family? But when Sophie looked at the way William smiled every time Sam came over, and the way Sam looked at her with such tenderness, she couldn't deny the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this time, it would be different. For now, Sophie decided to take things one day at a time, grateful for the new beginning she had found with Sam, and hopeful that their future together would be one filled with love, acceptance, and the family she had always dreamed of having. Little did she know, the road ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, but Sophie was ready to face whatever came next, knowing she was no longer alone. Sophie's life seemed to be settling into a new rhythm. Sam had become an integral part of their lives, and William adored him. Their little family unit was beginning to feel complete. But despite the outward appearance of happiness, Sophie couldn't shake the nagging feeling of doubt that had been building inside her. Every so often, she would find herself wondering if the harmony they had found could really last. It wasn't that Sam gave her any reason to worry. He was kind, patient, and attentive. He never seemed bothered by the comments from strangers or the curious glances they received when they were out together. But Sophie couldn't forget what had happened with Mark, how quickly he had withdrawn after William's birth. She had been blindsided once before, and the fear of it happening again weighed heavily on her. One evening, after putting William to bed, Sophie and Sam sat together on the couch. The room was quiet, the soft glow of a single lamp casting warm shadows on the walls. Sam reached for Sophie's hand, but she pulled it away instinctively, not even realizing what she had done. Sam frowned slightly, looking at her with concern. "Is everything okay, Soph?" Sophie sighed, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't meant to pull away, but the doubts that had been swirling in her mind all day were making it hard for her to relax. "I don't know," she admitted quietly, avoiding his gaze. I guess I've just been thinking." Sam turned toward her, his brow furrowing. "Thinking about what?" Sophie hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to express the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "About us. About William. About how complicated everything is." Sam's face softened, and he reached out again, gently placing his hand over hers. "Soph, whatever it is, we can talk about it. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Sophie wanted to believe him. She really did. But the memories of Mark's abandonment still haunted her. She turned to look at Sam, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "What if this doesn't work out, Sam? What if one day you wake up and decide this is all too much? What if you leave like Mark did?" Sam's expression shifted, a deep sadness settling in his eyes. He reached up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away the tear that had finally fallen. "I'm not Mark," he said softly but firmly. "I know what he did hurt you, Sophie, and I know it's hard for you to trust someone after that. But I need you to believe me when I say that I'm here for the long haul." Sophie closed her eyes, letting his words sink in, but the fear still lingered. "I just don't want William to get hurt," she whispered. "He's already been through so much. I can't let him get attached to someone who might not stay." Sam's heart ached for Sophie. He could see how fiercely protective she was of William, and he loved her even more for it. "I understand why you're scared," he said gently, "but I promise you, I'm not going to leave. I love you, Sophie. I love William. I want to be here for both of you, through the good and the bad." Sophie's breath hitched at his words. This was the first time Sam had said he loved her. She hadn't been expecting it, and it caught her off guard. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to pull away, to protect herself from the possibility of more heartbreak. But the other part of her, the part that longed for connection and love, wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this time, it could be different. Sophie looked into Sam's eyes, searching for any hint of doubt or hesitation. But all she saw was sincerity. His gaze was steady, his expression full of warmth and compassion. For the first time in a long time, Sophie felt a small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could let go of the past. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words felt both terrifying and freeing as they left her lips. Sam's face lit up with a smile, one of pure joy. He leaned in and kissed her softly, a kiss that promised not only affection but also security. As they pulled apart, Sophie felt some of her fears begin to melt away, replaced by the warmth of Sam's embrace. "I'm not going anywhere," Sam repeated, his voice firm but tender. "We're in this together." The next few weeks were a turning point for Sophie. She worked hard to push past her doubts, allowing herself to lean on Sam more. Their relationship deepened, and for the first time in years, Sophie felt like she had a partner who was truly committed to building a life with her and William. But as much as things were improving at home, there were still external challenges that couldn't be ignored. One afternoon, Sophie picked William up from school, and as he climbed into the back seat, she noticed his usual bright smile was gone. His shoulders slumped, and he stared down at his shoes, avoiding her gaze. "Hey, buddy," Sophie said softly as she started the car. "How was school today?" William didn't answer right away, and Sophie's heart sank. She knew that look. Something was wrong. "William, sweetie, did something happen?" After a moment of silence, William finally spoke, his voice small and shaky. "Some kids at school, they said I don't look like you." Sophie's heart broke at the familiar sting of those words. She had prepared herself for the day William would start noticing the differences between their appearances, but she hadn't expected it to come so soon, or for it to hurt this much. "What did you say to them?" Sophie asked, trying to keep her voice calm. William shrugged, still staring at his shoes. "I didn't know what to say. They kept asking if I was adopted, and when I told them I wasn't, they laughed." Sophie gripped the steering wheel tightly, fighting back the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Oh, sweetheart," she said softly, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. "I'm so sorry that happened." As they drove home in silence, Sophie's mind raced. She had always known there would be challenges raising a child who didn't look like her, but hearing that William was already being teased at such a young age tore at her. She hated that the world could be so cruel, that people could be so narrow-minded. But she also knew that shielding William from those realities wasn't the answer. He needed to know how to stand up for himself, how to be proud of who he was. When they got home, Sophie sat down with William on the couch, pulling him close. "William, I know what those kids said hurt you, but I want you to remember something very important." He looked up at her, his eyes full of confusion and sadness. "What?" "People are going to say things sometimes. Things that don't make sense or things that are hurtful. But what matters most is that you know the truth about yourself. You are my son, and I love you more than anything in this world. You don't have to look like me for us to be a family. We're connected by love, not just by how we look." William sniffled and nodded, leaning his head against her shoulder. "But why do people care so much?" Sophie sighed, wishing she had a better answer. "Sometimes people don't understand things that are different from what they're used to, but that doesn't make them right. And it definitely doesn't mean you should ever feel bad about who you are." William looked up at her with a small smile, and Sophie kissed the top of his head, grateful for his resilience. Later that evening, Sophie told Sam about what had happened at school. Sam's expression darkened with anger when he heard about the teasing, but he quickly masked it, knowing that Sophie didn't need more attention. "That's tough," he said softly, shaking his head. "Kids can be cruel sometimes." Sophie nodded, her heart heavy. "I just don't know how to protect him from this. I want him to grow up confident. But how do I help him when the world keeps reminding him that he's different?" Sam reached for her hand. "You're doing everything right. Sophomore William knows he's loved, and that's the most important thing. The world might be tough, but with you by his side and me too, he'll learn how to face it." Sophie smiled gratefully at Sam, her chest warming with the reassurance that, for the first time, she wasn't facing these challenges alone. Together, they could raise William to be proud of who he was, no matter what anyone said. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that more challenges lay ahead. She knew the world would continue to test them, and she would have to fight harder than ever to protect her son. Yet, as long as she had Sam and William by her side, she believed they could face anything. Still, Sophie couldn't help but wonder, would their love truly be enough to overcome the harsh realities of the world outside? Or were there deeper challenges still waiting to surface? It had been almost 7 years since Mark had walked out of Sophie's life, abandoning her in the hospital the day William was born. In all that time, he had never tried to contact her, never asked about William, and never seemed to care about the family he had left behind. Sophie had long accepted that Mark was out of their lives for good, and she had moved on with the belief that he wasn't coming back. But life has a way of bringing the past back when you least expect it. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything changed. Sophie was at home, helping William with his homework, while Sam was out running errands. The doorbell rang, and Sophie assumed it was a neighbor or maybe even a package delivery. She opened the door casually, not expecting to see the man standing before her, Mark. For a moment, Sophie couldn't breathe. The sight of him standing there, taller, older, but undeniably the same man she once loved, threw her into a whirlwind of confusion and anger. Memories of their time together, their shared dreams, and the devastation he left behind rushed back in a flood of emotions. But more than anything, Sophie felt the pain of his betrayal as fresh as the day he left. "Mark," she said, her voice cold and guarded. "What are you doing here?" Mark shifted uncomfortably, his hands stuffed in his pockets as if unsure of what to say. He glanced past her into the house, his eyes lingering for a moment, perhaps searching for William. "Sophie, I know it's been a long time. I came to talk about William." At the mention of William's name, Sophie's protective instincts flared. She stood taller, blocking the doorway, her heart racing. "You don't get to talk about William," she snapped. "You lost that right when you walked out on us. What do you want, Mark?" Mark looked down at his feet, clearly uneasy under Sophie's sharp gaze. "I know I messed up," he admitted, his voice low. "I was scared, confused, but I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I want to make things right. I want to meet my son." Sophie's blood boiled. The audacity of Mark showing up after 7 years, asking to meet the son he had abandoned, felt like a cruel joke. She couldn't believe he thought he could just waltz back into their lives as if nothing had happened. "You've got some nerve," Sophie said, her voice trembling with fury. "You walked out on us. You left me alone in that hospital with a newborn baby, and now, after all these years, you think you can just show up and play father? William doesn't even know who you are, Mark." Mark flinched at her words, but he didn't back down. "I know I made mistakes," he said, a hint of desperation in his voice. "But I've changed, Sophie. I'm not the same person I was back then. I've been going through therapy, working on myself, and I want to be a part of William's life. He deserves to know his father." Sophie laughed bitterly, crossing her arms over her chest. "William already has a father. Sam has been more of a father to him in a year than you've been in his entire life." Mark's eyes darkened at the mention of Sam. "Sam? Who the hell is Sam?" "He's my partner," Sophie said firmly, "and William's father figure. He's the one who's been there for him, who loves him and treats him like his own." Mark's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Sophie could see the anger flicker in his eyes. But he quickly composed himself, taking a deep breath. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Sophie. I just want a chance to meet my son. Please." Sophie stared at him, her emotions swirling. She wanted to slam the door in his face, to tell him he didn't deserve to meet William, but something held her back. William was the one thing that truly mattered, and as much as she hated to admit it, William had the right to know where he came from, to understand the truth about his biological father. "I need time to think about this," Sophie said finally, her voice stiff and controlled. "I'm not making any promises, Mark. You don't get to just come back and turn our lives upside down. William doesn't know you, and I'm not sure he needs to." Mark nodded, seeming to understand the weight of her words. I get it. I know this isn't going to be easy, but I'll wait. Just think about it. For William's sake. Sophie's heart pounded as she watched him turn and walk away, his figure retreating down the street. She closed the door slowly, leaning against it as the reality of the situation sank in. Mark was back. After all these years of building a new life for herself and William, he was back. That night, Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, her mind racing. She had spent the entire day replaying the conversation with Mark, trying to make sense of it. She hadn't told William yet, and she didn't know if she should. What would she even say? How could she explain to her son that the man who had abandoned him wanted back in his life? Sam noticed her unease as soon as he returned home. He found her sitting in the dimly lit bedroom, staring at the wall, deep in thought. "Soph, what's going on?" he asked gently, sitting down beside her. Sophie sighed heavily, rubbing her temples. Mark showed up today. Sam's face tightened and a wave of tension filled the room. Mark, as in William's father. Sophie nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. He says he wants to meet William. He says he's changed and that he's been in therapy, working on himself. Sam's eyes narrowed, his protective instincts kicking in. "And you believe him?" "I don't know what to believe," Sophie admitted, her voice shaky. "He looked different, sounded different. But how can I trust him after what he did? How can I let him back into our lives?" Sam took her hand, his touch grounding her. "You don't owe him anything, sophomore. You've been raising William on your own for years, and you've done an incredible job. If Mark really wants to be part of William's life, he needs to earn that right. He doesn't just get to walk back in because it's convenient for him." Sophie nodded, grateful for Sam's steady presence. But the decision still weighed heavily on her. I don't want to make the wrong choice. What if William wants to know him? What if denying him the chance to meet Mark hurts him more in the long run? Sam sighed, understanding her dilemma. "You have to do what's best for William. But whatever happens, we'll face it together." Sophie leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his arms around her. She knew Sam was right, but the road ahead felt more complicated than ever. Her past with Mark was something she had tried to bury, but now it was resurfacing, threatening to disrupt the life she had fought so hard to rebuild. The next day, Sophie decided it was time to talk to William. She sat him down at the kitchen table, her heart racing as she prepared for the conversation. William looked up at her with those bright, curious eyes, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. "William," Sophie began softly, "there's something I need to talk to you about." William's brows furrowed, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it, Mom?" Sophie took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Do you remember how we've talked about your father? About how he's not part of our lives?" William nodded slowly, looking confused. "Yeah, you said he left when I was born." Sophie bit her lip, feeling the weight of her words. "Well, your father, Mark, came by yesterday. He wants to meet you." William's eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and uncertainty crossing his face. "He does? Why?" "He says he's changed, that he wants to get to know you," Sophie explained carefully. "But I want you to know that this is your decision. You don't have to meet him if you don't want to." William sat quietly for a moment, processing the information. "I don't know, Mom. Why did he leave? Why didn't he want me?" Sophie's heart shattered at the question. How could she explain the complexities of Mark's abandonment to a child? She reached across the table, taking William's hand in hers. "I don't know why, sweetie. Sometimes people make mistakes, big ones, and it hurts the people around them. But none of this is your fault. Your dad leaving had nothing to do with you. You're amazing, and I love you more than anything." William looked down, his small hand gripping hers tightly. "Do you think he's really different now?" Sophie hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know, William. People can change, but it's up to you to decide if you want to give him a chance. Whatever you choose, I'll be here with you every step of the way." William nodded, still looking uncertain. "Can I think about it?" Of course, Sophie said gently. Take all the time you need. That night, as Sophie lay in bed beside Sam, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision looming over them. Mark's return had stirred up emotions she had long buried, and now it wasn't just her heart on the line. It was William's too. The days ahead would test them all, and Sophie knew that whatever William decided, their family would face challenges that could either bring them closer or tear them apart. But one thing was certain, they would face it together. What Sophie didn't realize, however, was that Mark's return wasn't the only twist fate had in store for them. The past had come back to haunt her, but the future held even more surprises, some of which she could never have imagined. In the days that followed Mark's unexpected return, a tense quiet settled over Sophie's household. The usual light-hearted atmosphere between her, William, and Sam seemed strained as the weight of the decision about Mark loomed over them. Sophie tried to maintain normalcy for William's sake, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She found herself constantly checking in with William, trying to gauge his thoughts, while battling her own emotions about Mark. William, for his part, was unusually quiet. He'd spend more time than usual alone in his room, reading or playing video games, clearly working through his feelings. Every time Sophie asked him about how he was doing, he'd respond with a shrug or a simple, "I'm fine, Mom." But Sophie knew him too well. He wasn't fine. He was confused. One evening, as Sophie sat on the couch, the dim light of the television flickering across the room, William finally spoke up. "Mom!" His voice was hesitant, barely above a whisper. Sophie turned off the TV immediately, giving him her full attention. "What is it, sweetheart?" William shifted uncomfortably on his feet, his hands fiddling with the hem of his shirt. "I've been thinking a lot about Dad, about what it would be like to meet him." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. This was a conversation she'd been both dreading and waiting for. She motioned for William to sit beside her, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them in her lap. "And what have you been thinking?" William sat down, staring at the floor for a moment before finally meeting her eyes. I want to meet him. Just once. I want to know what he's like. But I'm scared." Sophie swallowed hard, nodding as she reached out to take his hand. "It's okay to be scared, William. This is a big decision, and it's completely normal to feel nervous." William bit his lip. "Do you think he really cares about me now? Or is he just saying that because he feels bad?" Sophie wished she had an answer that would make everything easier, but the truth was, she didn't know. "I think it's possible he feels bad about the choices he made in the past, and maybe he's trying to make things right now. But that doesn't change the fact that he hurt us. And you don't have to meet him if you don't feel ready. This is your choice." William looked thoughtful for a moment, his small brow furrowed in concentration. "I think I want to meet him, Mom. But can you and Sam be there with me?" Sophie's heart softened at his request. She had worried that William might feel torn between Sam and Mark, but hearing him ask for Sam to be there reassured her. Sam was already so deeply ingrained in William's life, and this proved just how much William trusted and relied on him. "Of course we'll both be there," Sophie said, squeezing his hand gently. "You're not alone in this, William. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The day of the meeting arrived far too quickly for Sophie's liking. They had arranged to meet Mark at a quiet park, a neutral place where William wouldn't feel overwhelmed. Sam had agreed to come along, though Sophie could tell he was less than thrilled about the situation. His usual easygoing demeanor had been replaced with a silent tension as they drove to the park. Still, he didn't say anything to discourage William, knowing how important this moment was. As they pulled up to the park, Sophie's stomach churned with nerves. She glanced back at William, who was sitting in the back seat, his hands clenched tightly around a book he had brought along, more for comfort than anything else. "You ready?" she asked softly. William nodded, though his expression remained serious. "Yeah, I think so." Sophie reached over and gave Sam's hand a reassuring squeeze before they all stepped out of the car. As they walked toward the park benches, Sophie spotted Mark standing near a tree, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, looking every bit as nervous as she felt. When Mark saw them approaching, his face lit up with a hesitant smile. "Hey, William," he said awkwardly, his eyes darting between his son and Sophie. "I'm really glad you came." William didn't respond right away, staying close to Sophie's side. The boy's eyes flickered with uncertainty as he looked at the man before him, trying to reconcile the image of his long-absent father with the stories he had heard. For a few moments, they all stood in awkward silence, the weight of years of absence hanging in the air. Finally, William spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hi." Mark's face softened, a mixture of relief and sorrow in his eyes. "You've gotten so big. I've missed a lot. I know that." Sophie watched as William shifted on his feet, clearly unsure of what to say. She felt Sam step closer, his presence steady and comforting beside her. Sam didn't say anything, but his silent support meant the world to Sophie. Mark cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to break the tension. I brought something for you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn-out baseball glove. "This was mine when I was your age. I thought maybe you might like to have it." William stared at the glove for a moment, then hesitantly reached out to take it. His fingers traced the faded leather, his eyes flickering with curiosity. "Thanks," he said softly, though his voice still carried a trace of uncertainty. Mark smiled, though it was tinged with regret. "I'm sorry, William," he said quietly, his voice filled with genuine emotion. "I know I haven't been there for you, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want to try. I want to get to know you, if you'll let me." William glanced up at Sophie, then at Sam, his eyes searching for reassurance. Sophie nodded encouragingly, letting him know that whatever he decided, it would be okay. After a long pause, William finally spoke again. "Maybe we can try," he said, his voice steady but cautious. "But it's going to take time." Mark nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "Of course. I'll wait as long as it takes." The weeks that followed were tense but transformative. Mark began slowly integrating himself into William's life, showing up for occasional visits and trying his best to prove he was serious about being a part of his son's world. William remained cautious, taking things step by step, but Sophie could see the curiosity in his eyes every time Mark came around. Sam, for his part, handled the situation with grace, though Sophie knew it wasn't easy for him. He was there every time Mark visited, offering silent support to both her and William. He never tried to replace Mark, but he made it clear that no matter what happened, his place in William's life was secure. One evening, after a particularly emotional visit from Mark, Sophie and Sam sat together on the porch, the cool evening breeze brushing against their skin. Sophie leaned her head on Sam's shoulder, feeling the weight of everything they had been through over the past few months. "I never thought this would happen," Sophie said quietly, her voice filled with exhaustion and relief. "Mark coming back, William meeting him. It's been a lot." Sam wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. "I know, but you've handled it better than anyone could. You've given William the chance to make his own decisions, and that's what matters most." Sophie smiled softly, though there was still a hint of uncertainty in her heart. "I just hope I made the right choice. For William. For us." "You did," Sam said firmly. "You've always put William first. And no matter what happens with Mark, you and I, this family, we're stronger because of it." Sophie felt a surge of gratitude and love for Sam. He had been her rock through everything, standing by her side even when things were messy and complicated. She knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As they sat there, the stars twinkling above them, Sophie realized something important. Family wasn't defined by blood or biology. It was defined by love, dedication, and the willingness to stand by each other, no matter how tough things got. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what happened with Mark, their family, the one she had built with Sam and William, would always be strong. But just as Sophie began to feel a sense of peace, She couldn't shake the feeling that the story with Mark wasn't over yet. The past had returned, and while they had made progress, there were still unresolved threads that could either bind them together or unravel everything. In the weeks following Mark's return, Sophie and Sam found themselves navigating a delicate balance. William had started to warm up to his biological father, but Sophie could sense a storm brewing. Mark was making more frequent visits, and while Sophie was glad William had the chance to know his father, she remained wary of Mark's intentions. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Mark asked to speak privately with Sophie. His face was serious, and Sophie's heart sank, knowing something big was coming. "I want more time with William," Mark said, his voice steady. "I've been thinking, and I think it's time we discuss custody." Sophie's stomach dropped. "Custody? Mark, you've been back for only a few months. William is still adjusting. You can't just waltz back in and demand more time." "I'm not trying to take him away," Mark said, his tone softening. "But I miss so much. I just want to make it right." Sophie clenched her jaw. "Making it right doesn't mean appending his life again. You've been gone for years. He has stability now with me and Sam." Mark nodded, but Sophie could see the determination in his eyes. "I'm not asking for a fight. I just want to be more involved." That night, Sophie shared her concerns with Sam, who listened quietly. "I think we need to be prepared," he said gently. "Talk to a lawyer. See what our options are." The idea of a legal battle terrified Sophie, but she agreed. They met with a lawyer, who reassured them that Sophie had the upper hand given Mark's absence from William's life. Still, the idea of a custody dispute weighed heavily on her mind. The next time they met with Mark, Sophie laid down her terms. "We'll go at William's pace. You can be involved, but no drastic changes unless he's ready. And no legal action unless absolutely necessary." Mark hesitated but finally agreed, realizing he had no choice but to earn his way back into his son's life slowly. Sophie, Sam, and William remained united, and Mark respected their boundaries. In the end, the true strength of their family wasn't defined by legal battles or forced reconciliation, but by love, trust, and patience. Sophie knew their path forward wouldn't be easy, but with Sam by her side and William leading the way, they would build a future that was truly theirs, on their own terms.